Okay, well, thank you very much. And we have a half hour today, so I'm not going to take very long with the introductions. I will say that just got an email from a client thanking Katie with reopening and calling her our reopening rock star. And I like that. I like that name very much. I think it works. So introducing Caitlin Anderson and Hermes Fernandez, our two reopening rock stars. And I'll hand the phase 2 program off to you, Hermes.
Thank you, Mike. It sounds like I'm trailing Katie here. So before I get into our presentation, since we're talking about reopening the capital region, I can't help but comment on what I've seen in the Albany area, especially over the last few days. The demonstrations welcomed, needed. Black lives do matter. We all know that. We all need to remind ourselves and recognize that the Black Lives Matter. And the reason what's so striking is the dark side of what's happened as well, seeing because of the organized criminal activity really at different places where there was looting, right? We're seeing boarded up buildings, things like that. So as we reopen the capital region for phase 2, I'm hoping that we will be reopening the capital region fully while we open fully with respect for all, and especially our Black brothers and sisters, because Black lives do matter. So beyond that, let me go to our presentation today, which we want our next slide. We are happily today at phase 2 of the reopening process, right? So everything that was opened in phase 1 remains open. Essential businesses remain open. And we now have a litany of new openings and a few things that I thought were going to be opening that have not opened. So offices, real estate services, in-store retail, vehicle sales, retail, rental, repair and cleaning, commercial buildings and management, and the one that everyone's been waiting for, hair salons and barbers, all can open as of today. We are waiting in a couple of weeks to see what occurs next, right? Every phase has a minimum of 2 weeks. So hopefully in 2 weeks, we will get to restaurants and food services and personal care services. These are large categories, right? You need to see actually what fits where, and it can be confusing. Retail, for example, retail is open, but indoor malls are not open. So if you went to Colony Center, for example, you could go to Macy's if Macy's decided to open today. Macy's has an exterior entrance. Any store with an exterior entrance attached to a mall can be open. Every strip shopping center now, those are the predominant structure these days, all their stores can be open fully. We're no longer at the point of retail, of curbside retail. Let's go to our next slide. Here we go. What you need to do, when we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, in terms of opening, is you need to have a plan, and you need to attest that you have a plan. And in order to have a plan, you need to look at the New York Forward website, and you will find topic by topic. And you'll see here, there's 3 things on the topics. There's summary guidelines, there's an affirmation, and then there is a template. Now, the summary guidelines are different than the detailed guidelines. You see in front of you, there is a column for mandatory and a column for recommended best practices. These summaries are actually less detailed than the detailed guidelines, which doesn't always happen. Sometimes the summaries and the details look just alike. We recommend to you that you read the detailed guidelines. You are in fact required to read the detailed guidelines. When you see the detailed guidelines, that is what when you finish a detailed guideline, you'll see an affirmation. That's the affirmation that you have to complete, that you've read the detailed guidelines and you've completed a plan. The safety plan template is very helpful, actually, and you can follow along against the guidelines to think about, how do I do these things for my business, right? What do I need to do? We need to do the same things we've talked about before, because things that we talked about before remain in place. The wearing of masks remains in place. The distance guidelines, 6 feet distance, remains in place. And Katie, I'm going to kick this to you in a second. One of the guidelines is occupancy. How many people can come into a facility? We're not talking about numbers in terms of, you don't have to reduce your workforce to a certain percentage. We're talking about spacing. So Katie, you and I have talked a lot about this. Let me ask you to comment on those points.
Yeah, the occupancy issue has become, as I like to say, the bane of my existence at this point, because it is it's so unclear at this point what needs to be happening. So for example, under the office guidelines, it says that offices, you need to limit the number of people in your building, that includes staff, to 50% of the maximum occupancy of the area as set by the certificate of occupancy. So there's a few problems here. One, a lot of places, when you're issued a certificate of occupancy, if you're issued one, it doesn't have the maximum occupancy listed on that certificate. And so we have been really trying to dig around and figure out what that means. And the main thing to remember here is this: until we have clearer guidance as to the math behind how you determine that maximum occupancy for your space, think about this: how are you going to have people be 6 feet apart at all times in your space, right? So if you have an office space that usually you can fit 10 people in, but all 10 of those people are pretty close together, you may have to limit that office space to 5 people. But if those 5 people are still going to be, they're going to be less than 6 feet apart, then you have to limit that to however many people that you can fit in that space where you can have people be 6 feet apart. That's the critical thing here, because that's really the only metric we can firmly point to say, this is what you need to do. So until until I can get my building inspector's license and really figure out what this means, for the meantime, it's that 6 foot of distance. It is, very confusing, but just remember, social distancing, and, you will be on your way to, as we all will, to following whatever it means from this state.
And Katie, in terms of the occupancy, what we're really seeing as well is there are some exceptions to that. Right? We know, right, the goal is 6 feet, the standard is 6 feet, but there are times that people come together. For example, at the cash register, right? We've already been, grocery stores are essential businesses, right? They remain open. Other retail remains open. You may have spots where there has to be interchange between individuals, right? At those spots, right, you would maybe be putting up plastic sheeting. You may be putting up clear plastic barriers, right? If you are a hair salon, for example, right, that's a place where there's literally, the guidelines talk about putting plastic sheeting between stations. Barbershops, the same thing. Recognizing that the customer and the barber or the hairdresser are going to be next to one another. In those circumstances, wearing masks, right? Wearing other personal protective equipment that may come up. But the starting point is, can I maintain the 6 foot distance? And when you cannot, right, you've got to be using some sort of personal protective equipment and other things. The other things becomes the hard thing to figure out.
Yeah, and I think that's It's the 50% occupancy issue. It comes up time and time again. But, what Hermes said is right on point. It's how are you going to comply with that 6 foot of distance? And, one other thing to look at too is the essential business list keeps being added to by Empire State Development. We have these recently added essential businesses, and these, this has been over the past like month or so. Many of you have probably had your dogs groomed in the meantime. I know my mother was very excited once she could go bring her Australian Shepherd to finally go get a haircut. But this is, pay attention to this list. This list is what's allowing businesses to reopen statewide. Dentists fully reopening statewide outside of these phases of reopening. That list is going to be added to in the future. And there's an executive order that was issued yesterday that seems to indicate that even more. And we'll discuss that in a little bit too. But one thing you really want to remember here is essential businesses, you have to firm guidance that's applicable to your industry or a discrete aspect of your business. So you are a credit union, you have an office space, that office space needs to follow the essential business guidance, even though you didn't have to before. Yes, it's confusing. Yes, it's, that is a hard thing to adapt to, but that is what we are all living with right now.
And Katie, if I could interject here, when you are looking at the businesses, whether it's whatever phase you are in, there is on the New York Forward website, right? And you can just type in New York Forward, you'll get this website. There is a tool to use because we have these broad categories of who can open at this point. And it's not always clear whether a business or whether an activity fits within one of those areas. So you go to the New York Forward website, and there is a tool that you work your way through. It begins with what county you're in, right? So we type in Albany, Schenectady, Rensselaer, one of our local counties, right? And then you have to work through there. If you know the NAIC code for your business, you simply type in that code. If you are not part of the 0.5% who know the NAIC code for your business, you have to then start to type in a description of your business, right? Which is just a couple of words, and then it brings you to the next screen. And then there's a screen after that. And then you get to the eureka moment when it says, your business is open, no, your business is closed, right? But it literally gets to that detail of that very simple answer. You're open, you're closed. You may not like the answer. If it says closed, it may not be the right answer because even this is a guidance document as well that's working its way through, and you may have some questions there about how to go backwards in as to whether you go forward. I think it's like 2 slides ago, for example, there was listed among the essential businesses as campgrounds, right? Well, campgrounds is different than children's camps, right? So we now know summer day camps will be allowed to be open. Overnight camps are not yet allowed to be open. We saw a press release yesterday from the governor's office that said summer overnight camps, there's a target date of June 29th. They're talking about whether they can open by that date, but there's nothing at this point other than a tease that we're talking about it, right? So you do have to go through this process of looking at what is available and what you may do. Now, some of the other pieces, and we may not be in the right spot here according to the slides, but I've noticed we're getting some questions about this. I want to address them. We've talked before when you're an essential business, and now when you are a business allowed to open under phase 1 or phase 2, and this will be the same thing at phase 3, you are going to have to put in place measures regarding your employees, screening measures, who can come to work, right? If you have more than one office, right, you don't have to use the same screening method in each location. You can make your screening methods fit your location, but you have to have screening measures. The screening measures may be a questionnaire. They may be, as Katie alluded to a few moments ago, they may be temperature monitoring, right? It could be a combination. But you have to have those screening measures. You cannot presume answers. People have to review the screens. Your staff is not supposed to keep the records of what people have reported, but you are supposed to have these screens. You can screen customers. Right? You have to screen employees. You have to screen contractors. Right? You may screen customers. You don't have to screen customers. Everyone must wear a mask. Right? Customers included. But you have discretion to allow a customer to enter your workplace without a mask. You are strongly encouraged. It's almost a kind of, you really must be doing this, right? And I recognize I said it in that awkward way. It's strongly encouraged. The discretion is essentially there to prevent blow-ups, right? To avoid problem circumstances. We have on the screen, right, face coverings, right? So they can be surgical masks, they can be cloth. If you've got some place where someone needs to wear an N95 mask because the job requires it, right? For example, painting in a body shop, right? N95 is what's required. We've talked about social distancing. We will talk about social distancing every time we do a webinar. Sanitizing is extremely important. This was in place for essential businesses. It's in place now for your new business, for opening businesses. What do you make available? How do you clean surfaces? Some businesses are going to have a tough time with this issue, right? What do you do if you're a retailer? Are you going to allow people to try on clothes or not? How are you going to handle returns, right? That comes up under sanitizing. There's a lot of guidance out there about, and I've seen this in some places, and it seems to work very well. Can you create a one-way path? Right? How do you keep the flow going so you avoid people coming into direct contact with one another? So you avoid you minimize the circumstances where people bump into one another. Your offices, right, are discouraged from having lunchrooms. You are going to have to figure out means with the elevators, right? How do you prevent people from gathering, especially if you tell people it's one person on the elevator at a time? I mean, what is going to happen here? How are we going to get people up and down? People are going to be waiting. So they're going to turn to the stairs. You're going to have the same problem there. I mean, those are practical issues that you've got to plan for. That should be included in the templates here. I know, Katie, I kind of talked myself out there. Is any place you'd want to go on that one?
One thing I want to add too, it's right at the beginning of what you were saying about screenings. When you do screenings if you're doing them for customers, okay, but for either employees or customers, exactly what Hermes said, you don't want to keep the record of what the screening said, right? You don't want to keep their temperature, but you do want to keep a record that somebody reviewed each of the responses, and keep that review check on file, right? So, I checked all of these things today and they were all compliant. You just kind of want to have somebody who's reading all of these things, making sure they're good, and then promptly getting rid of the responses. You do not want to be keeping those, but you do want to keep that record that it was reviewed. That was it.
And
I'm sorry. I was going to jump in because we've gotten a couple of questions about screenings. I figured now would be a good time to ask them. One question is there any difference between screenings from phase 1 to phase 2?
No, nor from essential businesses. I think actually with one exception. The one exception is what Katie and I were both just talking about, the requirement that the screening records be monitored, right, reviewed, and then we know it's now been stated explicitly you're not to keep the screening records.
Okay.
In that regard too, Mike, I want to mention, just kind of sliding into protective equipment, which is a little bit different than screening, but it's related, especially as you're having contractors come in or customers come in. You're going to need to keep on hand masks and possibly other personal protective equipment so that when people come to your now open business, you can offer it to them, right? You may have somebody walking in, you say, oh, we see you don't have a mask, let us offer you one, right? In fact, I think you may find businesses could begin to see some problems from regulators if they are not doing things like that. The same thing with contractors and others, and you cannot charge your employees for personal protective equipment.
Very true, very true. We've got one question about if we provide masks to employees, can we allow them to use their own mask, or can we require them to only use ours instead? You can require employees to use your mask. You can allow them to use one if they provide it, so long as it's sufficient. If they come in and it's a tissue across their mouth with dental floss over their ears, obviously you could say that that's not going to work, and you need to wear our mask or something else. We do have another question.
And Mike, before you move on that, I think this is something you could elaborate on, because you could find yourself, we've seen an awful lot of creative masks, and you may have some issues with what your staff is wearing on their mask, right? Right? If you've got staff coming in and saying, I hate my boss, and that's on their face mask, right? That's the kind of issue you guys have dealt with before in terms of clothing and things. And you've got issues there.
Absolutely. Same as if they came in with that written on their shirt or any other article of clothing, and you'd handle that in the same way. And if that's the only mask that they have and it's inappropriate, either you provide them a mask, or they need to go home and get a different mask if you've already provided them the masks and they claim that all the masks are home. Another question about screening is, if your company is doing temperature checks for all employees and visitors, do they have to have a questionnaire in addition to the temperature screening, or can they just do one or the other, just the temperatures or the questionnaire?
It's one or the other at this point. Right? Actually, I take that back. It's not one or the other. You can do both. You can do one or the other, or both. It's up to you what you deem to be appropriate for your site. And I know we've seen, you don't have to do the same thing for your customers as you do for your employees. And in fact, you don't even have to screen your customers. But there are many places that are screening customers as a way to say, look, to my employees, I'm maintaining a safe workplace. And look, my customers, I'm maintaining a safe place for you as well.
Very true. I'll hand it back to you in 1 second. We got one other question that is a good one to ask here, and it is for, when do we need to compensate employees for laundering masks? So there is a part of the minimum wage order about uniforms. If you provide uniforms to employees, there's a provision about providing an additional amount of money, depending upon how often the employee works and things of that nature, to the employee for laundering their uniforms during the week. That only applies if you, in the uniform that you're giving the employee, you don't give them enough so that they can launder it once per week. So if you've got an employee that works 5 shifts a week and you give them 5 uniforms, then you don't have to provide them anymore to launder those uniforms, because they can just throw that in the regular wash. If you've got an employee that works 3 days a week and you give them 3 uniforms, the same deal. You don't have to provide them that additional amount of money. So when it comes to masks, per the, face coverings, to be a little bit more correct in my terminology. When it comes to whether you need to pay employees for that, it's currently undetermined. Per the technical language of the minimum wage order, they would appear to be part of a uniform, except for the fact that you can require employees to wear a mask. You can give them the mask, or if they're using their own mask, it remains to be seen, given how small they are, right? Somebody can just wash in a sink, leave it out to dry, as opposed to throw it in a washing machine. is this something where you need to provide them an additional $10 per week if you give them 2 masks or 3 masks and they work 3 days per week? So we still don't have any guidance on that. If it's beyond question that if they work 5 days a week and you provide them 5 masks, you don't have to pay. It still remains to be seen if you give them less than the number of masks, less than the number of days they work per week, whether you need to give them anything additional. My argument would be that it's relatively de minimis because you can wash them in the sink and not necessarily wash them in the laundry like you would a traditional uniform. But again, that remains to be seen.
So if we could talk about a couple of other points on here, and I've kind of lost my place in terms of where we are on our slides.
Yeah, we could go to the, you want to go to the looking ahead
how
part?
far we are, yeah. No,
this
before we turn to phase 3, though, I think a couple
right.
of things I just want to make clear for everyone is the overall rules have not changed from phase 1 to phase 2. What's changed is just the businesses that fall into those places. So the screening requirements are the same. The PPE requirements are the same. There are requirements, and if you take a look at your businesses, you'll see this. We talked about this as we were going into phase 1. There is an expectation that businesses will be maintaining necessary records, which kind of runs counter to the whole idea of keeping the screening information. But there's an expectation that businesses will be keeping records necessary to help support contact tracing. Because, and this actually makes sense, because if you keep in mind that as we move into the phases, as we move into reopenings, we're moving away, right? We're moving away from shutdown. We're moving away from everybody stay in your home, and that's how you'll stay safe. We're moving out to, okay, let's have interaction with everyone, right? Let's do it as safely as possible. And if there are circumstances where people become ill, our line of defense, the plan is not to make everybody stay home, but the line of defense is to make people who are COVID positive stay home, get treatment, identify the people they've been exposed to, or they've exposed others to, right? Contact those people, quarantine those people, get those people tested, right? So it's the 4-part process, right, of identification, quarantine, tracing, isolation. Businesses are expected to be keeping records, and you're not necessarily going to have records of this for your customers, but we did talk about this in other circumstances. Have records of who's been at the business, who were they with, what did they do. Certainly, you know that for your workforce. Businesses, in terms of your customers, you may have much less information, but the public health authorities are going to be reliant on that information, asking you to tap into it, and you will see in all these plans, right, a requirement that you look into how do you handle this process as well, so that if there's a need to identify, there's a need to trace, that process can actually occur. That, I think we haven't highlighted that in any of our slides, but I think it's important to keep that in mind, and you will see that in the detailed requirements for each business. Where are we going next? We're trying to figure out here, and Katie was about to start talking on that, so I'll let you go.
No, I actually was going to go back to the screening issue. I pulled up one of the guidelines, right? I have the retail guidance in front of me right now. And it says, at a minimum, screening should be required of all employees and visitors and completed using a questionnaire that determines whether the employee or visitor has knowingly been in close contact with somebody who tested positive for COVID in the past 14 days, or experienced symptoms of COVID-19 in the past 14 days. That's what's hard here is that should, and then it says at a minimum, this should be required. So, when we were saying earlier about, to just clarify the temperature checks versus, the screening, you can, based on the way that guidance is written, it's very mushy, I guess is a good way to put it. You can, go down both of those avenues. The questionnaire is a great idea. It's a good option. We, for example, have to fill one out. If we're going to be going into the office, bond employees have to every day log into the system, and we fill out a questionnaire, answering those questions. So that hopefully that alleviates some confusion on that issue. But do you have anything to add, Hermes?
No, I was just actually, you reminded me of one other area where we're seeing some confusion before we talk about phase 3, and that is a question that's come up time and time again, and it only becomes more confusing. If I'm allowed to open, does that mean everything is open? And the answer is no. If you may have certain parts of your business that don't yet qualify to be open. What's allowed to be open are only those parts of the business that fall under the current guidelines. So let's say you, for example, have a fitness center, right, as well as your office, right? The fitness center in your office doesn't get to open at this point. The office opens, everyone can look longingly at the fitness center, but the fitness center remains closed.
Not all of us will look longingly at the fitness center, Hermes. Just to clarify.
We call it the Bacon Fitness Center. All of us will look longingly at it.
So I did receive one question by text that I'll put out there. What happens if you have a screening questionnaire, an employee doesn't answer, and they just show up to work? Do you make them fill out the questionnaire on the spot, or do you send them home? And my response to that from an employment standpoint would be, that's up to you. You obviously, at a minimum, would have to have them fill it out if you want them to stay there. But it is entirely within your discretion as an employer to say that we require you to do this before showing up. You didn't do this, you need to go home. You may have a policy that says the first time you do this without showing up, or first time you don't fill this out before showing up, you'll fill it out. The second time, we're not going to let you do that. And you can take disciplinary action against an employee that violates your policies in that way. It's your way of keeping that employee and all your other employees safe as well.
The also related to screening, so we've gotten this question a number of times as well. The screening requirements apply to your employees and contractors. What do you do with the delivery man? What do you do with the postal employee who comes to your office? There is nothing that says there is a exception for those individuals. But I would suggest to you, and this could turn out to be wrong, that someone who comes in and out, and I mean in and out, they don't linger, they don't hang around with the staff to talk, they come in the door, they drop off, they leave. The delivery person arrives, they leave. That person is required to have a mask. I do not expect a requirement that to be in place that says you screen that person before you let them in. But again, it's a caveat on there. It's not addressed. The language right now is written broadly enough that says everyone. I just don't see that as feasible to stop someone at the door for that, for that 15, 20-second circumstance.
We do have a question about larger employers that have several hundred or even 1,000 employees. How do they handle this screening process? What do you recommend? Particular apps or programs? So I'll throw that question out to both of you.
We know there are apps and programs. We're not recommending any of them at this point. We're recommending what is written in the guidance documents, right? Which is you have a screen, you have to make the screen work. So most likely, if you've got a lot of employees, the way you're going to make a screening document work, a screening instrument work, is doing something online. But you've got to look at the circumstances of your own business and what works for your business, right? It may be a completely different thing to screen 100 people coming into an accounting firm or a law firm than it is to screen 100 people coming into a food processing plant, which could have completely different sets of circumstances.
Or even, going to a job site, separate construction sites, right? That's a phase one
Right.
issue, but that's that is still real. The screening process needs to occur somehow.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Katie, you alluded to, if you're an essential business, right, and now your essential business falls into one of the categories, one of the phase 1, 2, phase 3, phase 4 categories. So let's say you're an essential business that hits the phase 2 category today, right? You were open anyway, but now you fit the phase 2 category. All the phase 2 rules now apply to you, right? Which means you have to have the plan. You have to start doing all those things that before you've thought up yourself. Now your plans have to meet these standards.
And there was a question as to when they'd have to start doing that, and my response
Today.
would be as soon as possible. Today, exactly.
Today is the requirement.
We do have an interesting question about what about cleaning staff who come in after hours? Do you have to have a screening process for them to come in and clean the place, or some sort of temperature check for them?
Yes, they're contractors. I mean, that's a great example. They are contractors. There's supposed to be a screening process for them as well. Now, the answer I don't know is if the cleaning contractor company has a screen in place, can you use their screen? Now, Katie, do you know the answer to that one? At this point, I think the answer is you've got to use your own as well.
I agree.
Or at least maybe you could get away with reviewing the cleaning company's screen, but that's the requirement. So we should move to our final point, which is the look ahead. I'll let Katie take that.
Yeah, I believe it was the last webinar that we did on this Hermes. This is a direct quote from Hermes, but it could have been another webinar that Hermes and I did where he said that phase 3 will be the real test. This is really when the rubber is going to hit the road. It's when restaurants are supposed to be opening back up and breweries are going to be opening back up in some capacity. And that is a big change. We don't know for certain at this point what other industries will be included in phase 3. It's not clear. So we don't know. And maybe we'll find out this week, maybe we'll find out next week, and maybe we'll find out the day that phase 3 is supposed to begin, like we did with phase 2. There
is the one advantage, Katie, that to our trailing some other regions is the phase 3 guidance should be available for the other 5 regions of the state, and we'll have 5 days to digest it.
Yep, and that certainly helps alleviate some panic on your ends, but less on ours, unfortunately. But one thing that's very interesting to look at is there was an executive order issued yesterday, and this executive order has this language in it that is Hermes and I have been mulling over and contemplating now for probably 20 hours at this point. And it says that the Empire State Development can determine what outdoor low-risk recreational activities and businesses may provide such activities. And so in the governor's email blast that he sends out every night, this was cited, and it pointed to golf, tennis, those recreational activities that were announced probably 2-3 weeks ago. I don't know. Time is abstract at this point. A while ago at this point. What we will, we're trying to see is, does this mean there will be more added to that Empire State Development list? Keep an eye out. We will also be keeping a very close eye on that list. But I would not be surprised to see more outdoor low-risk recreational activities added in there. We don't know what that means yet, besides golf and tennis, but we'll find out. And I think that's really it for the formal part of this.
Yeah, I think I just noticed, and we're getting some questions of points we've covered, but about screening, about record keeping, you do not keep the record. You keep a record that you reviewed the record, but you do not keep the record on the screens. And we realize that's awkward, but that's, we're not making that up. That's specifically in the guidance documents. The one thing I think we would both want to be sure, or all three of us would want to be sure, is that you actually do take a look at New York Forward, look at your industry, because while there are common themes, there are some surprises. There are some things that are very specific to particular industries, and you're going to want your plans to reflect those specific points as well as the general themes.
Okay. We did get one question. I think we may have gotten this question during our last webinar as well, but it's about paying employees for the time to complete the questionnaire prior to work. So the general answer is no, you don't need to do that, but I also wouldn't recommend making your questionnaire an exercise in the employees giving an essay on Moby Dick. It should be relatively short and fast and easy for them to complete, so that would be considered to be de minimis type time, and not have to pay employees for that time.
And we didn't mention the temperature in this webinar, which we usually mention. The alarming temperature is 100.4.
Good point. Very good point. I think this will be the last question, since we've gone a little bit over our half-hour time period, and we'll keep it to 45 minutes. If our office has no plans to open anytime soon, do we still have to attest to the guidelines? Cleaning staff is still coming in and cleaning, even nobody in the office. So if everybody's still working remotely and they can be open, do they have to attest? But they're not open at their location. Do they have to attest to the guidelines?
I say the answer to that is no, right? Because you're not open.
I agree.
Okay.
The whole point of this is, it's about trying to bring people back into the office. So if you are continuing to operate as we've been operating now since March, then there's no change for that. We're not, this guidance doesn't apply to remote work, right? We're not, luckily it doesn't apply to remote work in my house. Thank God.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you both very much. And thanks everybody today for attending, and we'll see you for phase 3.